The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Sarah Chun stepped out of the transport vehicle, her simple civilian clothes and worn backpack making her look more like a lost college student than someone who belonged in this highly secure facility. The driver barely acknowledged her as he dumped her single duffel bag on the concrete and drove away, leaving her standing alone at the main gate. Sarah adjusted her glasses and looked up at the imposing steel barriers and guard towers that surrounded Naval Base Coronado. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beyond the perimeter, its waves crashing against the rocks with a rhythmic intensity that matched her own heartbeat. She had been away from this place for 3 years, but every detail remained etched in her memory, like a photograph she couldn't quite forget. The security checkpoint buzzed with activity as personnel in crisp uniforms moved with purpose through the gates. Sarah approached the guard station, fishing her temporary access card from her pocket. The young Marine behind the bulletproof glass looked her up and down with barely concealed skepticism. "Sarah Chun, reporting for assignment," she said quietly, sliding the card through the slot. The Marine scanned the card and frowned at his computer screen. "Says here you're assigned to the communications division as a civilian contractor." His tone carried the dismissive edge that military personnel often reserve for outsiders. "Building 12, East Wing. Follow the yellow line on the ground." Sarah nodded and gathered her belongings, but she could feel his eyes tracking her movement as she walked away. It was the same look she remembered from her academy days, when her small stature and quiet demeanor had made others underestimate her capabilities. Back then, it had bothered her. Now, she found it almost amusing. The base had expanded significantly during her absence. New buildings dotted the landscape, their modern glass and steel construction contrasting sharply with the older concrete structures she remembered. Personnel moved between buildings with the efficient precision of a well-oiled machine, but Sarah noticed the subtle signs of tension that seemed to permeate the atmosphere. Conversation stopped when she passed, and she caught fragments of worried discussions about budget cuts, restructuring, and uncertain futures. Building 12 sat at the far end of the base, a 3-story structure that housed various support departments. Sarah found the communications division on the 2nd floor, a maze of cubicles and offices filled with the constant hum of computers and radio equipment. The smell of coffee and electrical circuits hung in the air, creating an oddly comforting atmosphere that reminded her of her early days in the service. "You must be the new contractor." The voice belonged to Lieutenant Mark Stevens, a lean man in his 30s with sharp features and an expression that suggested he had better things to do than deal with civilian personnel. "I'm a department supervisor. We weren't expecting much from headquarters, but I guess this is what we get when the budget gets slashed." Sarah extended her hand, which Stevens shook briefly before turning his attention to a stack of papers on his desk. "Your workstation is over there," he said, pointing to a corner cubicle that looked like it hadn't been used in months. "Janet will get you set up with a computer and access codes. Try not to break anything important." Janet Morrison proved to be a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a maternal manner that immediately put Sarah at ease. She had worked in communications for 15 years and knew every system in the building like the back of her hand. As she helped Sarah navigate the computer setup, she provided a running commentary on the various personalities and politics that shaped daily life in the department. "Don't mind Stevens," Janet said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "He's been passed over for promotion twice, and it's made him bitter toward anyone he sees as competition. The rest of us are decent enough, though we're all walking on eggshells these days." "Why's that?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Janet lowered her voice even further. "There's talk of major changes coming down from the top. Some people think whole departments might be eliminated. Others say we're getting a new commanding officer who's going to shake things up. Nobody knows for sure, but everyone's worried about their jobs." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Sarah. If only they knew that the changes they feared were already sitting among them, disguised as a quiet contractor who seemed more interested in fixing computer problems than wielding authority. She had specifically requested this undercover assignment to get a ground-level view of the base's operations before assuming her official role. Over the following days, Sarah settled into a routine that felt both familiar and strange. She arrived early, worked diligently on mundane communication system maintenance, and observed everything happening around her with the trained eye of someone who had spent years learning to see beyond surface appearances. Her colleagues gradually warmed to her quiet competence, though some remained skeptical of her presence. The most vocal of these skeptics was Staff Sergeant Rebecca Torres, a communications specialist with a sharp tongue and an apparent chip on her shoulder about civilian contractors. Torres had made it clear from day one that she viewed Sarah's presence as an unnecessary intrusion into what should be purely military territory. "I don't understand why we need outside help," Torres complained loudly during a coffee break, making sure Sarah could hear every word. "We've been managing these systems just fine without some college grad who probably never spent a day in uniform telling us how to do our jobs." Sarah continued typing at her workstation, but she filed away every word of Torres' commentary. The sergeant's attitude reflected a broader problem within the base's culture, a resistance to change, and outside influence that could prove problematic when real reforms needed to be implemented. Lieutenant Stevens seemed to encourage Torres' hostility, perhaps seeing it as a way to assert his own authority over the civilian contractor who had been thrust upon his department. He assigned Sarah the most tedious and meaningless tasks, relegating her to equipment inventories and database updates that anyone with basic computer skills could handle. "Think you can manage updating these equipment logs without screwing anything up?" Stevens asked one morning, dropping a thick folder on Sarah's desk with unnecessary force. "It's not exactly rocket science, but I figure it's about the right speed for someone with your background." Sarah looked up at him with the same mild expression she had maintained since her arrival. "I'll do my best," she said simply, opening the folder and beginning to work through the documents with methodical precision. What Stevens didn't realize was that these seemingly mundane tasks were giving Sarah exactly the kind of detailed operational overview she needed. Every equipment log told a story about budget allocations, maintenance schedules, and resource management. Every database entry revealed patterns of efficiency and waste that would need to be addressed once she assumed command. The other personnel in the department began to form their own opinions about the quiet new contractor. Some, like Janet, appreciated her willingness to help with any task, no matter how small. Others remained suspicious of her presence, whispering among themselves about her true purpose and qualifications. Petty Officer James Wilson, a young technician fresh out of training, seemed genuinely curious about Sarah's background. During lunch breaks, he would ask her questions about civilian life and express his own uncertainties about military career paths. Sarah found herself drawn to his enthusiasm and genuine desire to excel, recognizing something of her younger self in his eager questions and determination to prove himself. "Did you ever think about joining the military?" Wilson asked one afternoon as they worked together on a particularly stubborn radio system. Sarah paused in her work, considering how to answer without revealing too much. "I've always had a lot of respect for military service," she said carefully. "Sometimes circumstances lead us down different paths than we originally planned." Wilson nodded thoughtfully. "I joined because I wanted to make a difference, But sometimes I wonder if I'm really contributing anything meaningful stuck in here, maintaining equipment, while other people are out there doing the real work." "Every job has its importance," Sarah replied, making a mental note to ensure that talented young personnel like Wilson received better guidance and opportunities for advancement once she took command. "The key is understanding how your role fits into the bigger picture." As the days passed, Sarah began to see the full scope of the problems facing the base. Communication breakdowns between departments, outdated equipment that should have been replaced years ago, and a general sense of low morale that permeated every level of the organization. The personnel were competent and dedicated, but they lacked the leadership and resources necessary to operate at peak efficiency. The situation came to a head during her second week when a critical communication system failure threatened to disrupt a major training exercise. Stevens panicked, calling in technicians from other departments and creating a chaotic scene of overlapping authority and conflicting solutions. Sarah watched the confusion unfold for nearly an hour before quietly approaching the main control panel. "Mind if I take a look?" she asked Janet, who was nearly in tears trying to coordinate the various repair efforts. "At this point, I'll try anything," Janet replied desperately. Sarah studied the system diagnostics for a few minutes, then began making systematic adjustments to the configuration settings. Within 20 minutes, the system was fully operational again, much to the amazement of everyone present. Stevens tried to take credit for the resolution, but word quickly spread through the department about who had actually solved the problem. "How did you know how to fix that?" Torres demanded, her usual hostility now mixed with grudging curiosity. Sarah shrugged modestly. "I've worked with similar systems before. Sometimes it helps to have fresh eyes on a problem." It was a carefully crafted understatement. The truth was that she had designed parts of the communication protocols they were using back when she was a junior officer working on advanced naval communication systems. But revealing that level of expertise would raise questions she wasn't ready to answer. The incident marked a turning point in how her colleagues viewed her. Stevens continued his dismissive attitude, but others began to seek out her advice on technical problems and operational questions. Sarah found herself walking a careful line between being helpful and avoiding too much attention that might expose her true identity. During her third week, Sarah overheard a conversation between Stevens and Torres that made her blood run cold. They were discussing rumors about the incoming commanding officer, and their comments revealed a level of disrespect and insubordination that went far beyond normal military griping. "I heard the new CEO is some young hotshot who got promoted too fast," Stevens was saying. "Probably never spent time in a real operational unit. These fast-track officers think they know everything, but they don't understand how things really work at the ground level." Torres nodded enthusiastically. "We'll see how long this one lasts." The last two CEOs who tried to change things around here didn't stay long once they realized what they were up against. Sometimes people need to be reminded that there's a difference between what looks good on paper and what actually works in practice. Sarah continued typing at her workstation, but her mind was racing. The implication was clear. Stevens and Torres and possibly others had actively worked to undermine previous commanding officers. They saw themselves as the guardians of the status quo, protecting their little fiefdom from outside interference regardless of the broader impact on base operations. That evening, Sarah sat in her temporary quarters reviewing everything she had observed and learned during her 3 weeks undercover. The picture that emerged was troubling, but not entirely unexpected. The base was suffering from systemic problems that went beyond simple budget constraints or organizational growing pains. There was a culture of resistance to change, combined with pockets of incompetence and insubordination that needed to be addressed decisively. She thought about Wilson and Janet and the many other dedicated personnel who were doing their best under difficult circumstances. They deserved better leadership and clearer direction. They deserved a commanding officer who understood both the challenges they faced and the potential they possessed. As Sarah prepared for sleep, she reflected on the strange position she found herself in. In a few days, she would reveal her true identity and assume command of the very people who had been dismissing and underestimating her. Some would be shocked, others embarrassed, and a few might even be relieved to finally have clear direction from someone who understood their daily reality. The irony was that Stevens and Torres were partially right about one thing. She was young for her rank, and she had been promoted quickly through a combination of exceptional performance and specialized expertise. What they didn't understand was that her rapid advancement had come through proven leadership under pressure, not political connections or academic credentials alone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and observations. Sarah planned to spend more time in other departments, getting a broader view of base operations before her official assumption of command. She needed to understand not just the problems, but also the people and systems that would be key to implementing solutions. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah couldn't help but smile slightly at the thought of the expressions on certain faces when they learned the truth about their quiet, unassuming contractor. The next few weeks were going to be very interesting indeed, and she was looking forward to the opportunity to transform potential into performance across every level of the organization. The fourth week of Sarah's undercover assignment brought unexpected opportunities to observe the base's operations from multiple angles. A scheduled rotation of communication personnel to support a joint training exercise gave her the chance to work directly with different departments, each revealing new layers of the complex organizational culture she would soon inherit. Her first assignment took her to the Operations Center, a bustling nerve center where real-time decisions coordinated base activities with fleet movements across the Pacific. The contrast with the Communications Department was immediately apparent. Here, personnel moved with crisp efficiency, their interactions marked by clear protocols and mutual respect. Commander Angela Rodriguez ran the operations with a firm but fair hand, treating subordinates as valued team members rather than obstacles to be managed. "You're the contractor from communications?" Rodriguez asked when Sarah reported for her temporary assignment. "Stevens mentioned you have some technical expertise. We could use someone who understands both old and new systems during this transition period." Sarah nodded respectfully. "I'm here to help however I can, ma'am." Rodriguez smiled, and Sarah caught a glimpse of the leadership style she hoped to emulate once she assumed command. "Good attitude. Let me show you what we're working with here." The operations center managed everything from routine supply deliveries to complex multi-unit exercises involving ships, aircraft, and ground personnel. Sarah quickly realized that this department was functioning at a level significantly higher than communications, despite working with many of the same resource constraints. The difference came down to leadership and culture. During her second day in operations, a crisis emerged that tested everyone's capabilities. A supply ship experienced mechanical failures during rough weather, requiring immediate coordination between multiple agencies to ensure both crew safety and cargo security. Sarah watched Rodriguez orchestrate the response with calm professionalism, delegating responsibilities clearly while maintaining oversight of the overall situation. "Chun, I need you to establish backup communication links with the Coast Guard," Rodriguez instructed during the height of the crisis. "Use whatever protocols work best, but make sure we maintain contact throughout the rescue operation." Sarah threw herself into the task, drawing on knowledge and experience that went far beyond what anyone expected from a civilian contractor. She not only established the requested communication links, but also identified potential interference patterns that could have disrupted coordination at critical moments. Her proactive solutions helped ensure seamless communication throughout the 8-hour rescue operation. "Outstanding work," Rodriguez said afterward, reviewing Sarah's contribution to the successful mission. "Where did you learn to think 3 steps ahead like that?" "Previous experience with emergency communications," Sarah replied carefully. "Sometimes the best solutions come from understanding how systems fail before they actually do." Rodriguez studied her with intelligent eyes that suggested she was beginning to suspect there was more to Sarah than met the eye. "Well, whatever your background, you've got good instincts. If you ever consider a career change, the Navy could use people like you." The irony of the comment wasn't lost on Sarah, but she simply nodded and returned to her assigned tasks. Working in operations gave her valuable insight into what effective leadership looked like at the departmental level, and she made mental notes about Rodriguez's management style and the systems that made her team so successful. Her next rotation took her to the supply and logistics department, where a different set of challenges revealed another aspect of base operations. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thompson ran logistics with the practical wisdom of someone who had spent 20 years making military bureaucracy actually work for the people who needed it most. Thompson's approach was less polished than Rodriguez's, but equally effective in its own way. He knew every regulation, every supplier, and every workaround that could turn impossible requests into accomplished missions. More importantly, he understood that logistics was ultimately about taking care of people, not just moving equipment from one place to another. "The thing about this job," Thompson explained to Sarah as they reviewed supply requests, "is that everyone thinks it's just about counting beans and ordering parts. But really, it's about understanding that when someone needs something, there's usually a good reason for it. Your job is to figure out how to say yes instead of looking for excuses to say no." Sarah appreciated Thompson's philosophy, especially after witnessing Stephen's tendency to create obstacles rather than solutions. She spent several days learning the complex web of relationships and procedures that kept the base supplied and operational, gaining insights that would prove invaluable when she needed to implement changes from the commanding officer level. The logistics department also provided her first direct exposure to the broader morale problems affecting the base. Personnel from various departments came through regularly to request supplies, file reports, or coordinate deliveries, and their conversations revealed a consistent pattern of frustration and uncertainty about the future. "You hear anything about this new CEO they're bringing in?" asked a maintenance supervisor during one of these visits. "Word is they're planning major changes, maybe even closing down some departments entirely." Thompson shrugged diplomatically. "Same rumors everyone's been hearing for months. Until someone official tells us something definite, I'm not losing sleep over it. We do our jobs, take care of our people, and adapt to whatever comes next. But Sarah could see the concern in Thompson's eyes, despite his calm exterior. Even the most competent and experienced personnel were struggling with the uncertainty created by months of speculation and conflicting information. The leadership vacuum was taking a toll on everyone, regardless of their individual capabilities or dedication. During her time in logistics, Sarah also encountered Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, a supplies specialist who had been at the base for 8 years and seemed to know everyone's story. Gonzalez had a reputation as someone who could get things done through a combination of personal relationships and creative problem-solving, but she also possessed a sharp awareness of the political undercurrents that influenced daily operations. "You're the contractor who fixed the communication system last week," Gonzalez said when they were introduced. People are still talking about that. Stevens was pretty upset that a civilian showed up his whole department. Sarah tried to downplay the incident. "I just happened to notice something that others missed. Team effort, really." Gonzalez laughed knowingly. "Right? Well, just be careful. Stevens doesn't like being shown up, and he's got friends in other departments. Some people around here don't handle change very well, especially when it makes them look bad." The warning proved prophetic. Later that week, Sarah learned that Stevens had been making inquiries about her background, trying to find information that might discredit her or justify removing her from the base entirely. His efforts had been unsuccessful so far, but they revealed a level of petty vindictiveness that concerned her. More troubling was the discovery that Stevens wasn't acting alone. A small group of mid-level personnel had formed an informal alliance dedicated to maintaining the status quo and resisting any changes that might threaten their established positions. They shared information, coordinated their opposition to new initiatives, and worked actively to undermine personnel who didn't fit their vision of how things should operate. Sarah's investigation into this group revealed names she recognized from personnel files she had studied before her assignment. Most were competent enough at their individual jobs, but had developed an investment in the base's problems that made them resistant to solutions. They benefited from the confusion and inefficiency that allowed them to operate with minimal oversight while avoiding accountability for results. The realization that she would be dealing with organized resistance rather than simple incompetence changed Sarah's approach to planning for her official assumption of command. She would need to move quickly and decisively to establish her authority while providing clear incentives for cooperation and equally clear consequences for continued obstruction. Her final rotation assignment took her to the Training and Personnel Development Department, where she encountered yet another perspective on base operations. Lieutenant Commander David Park oversaw all professional development programs, from basic skills training to advanced leadership courses, and his insights into personnel capabilities proved invaluable. "The frustrating thing," Park explained during one of their conversations, "is that we have incredibly talented people at every level. But talent without direction just creates frustration. People want to excel, but they need to understand how their efforts contribute to larger goals." Park's observation resonated deeply with Sarah's own analysis of the base's problems. The personnel weren't lacking in ability or dedication. They were lacking in leadership that could channel their efforts effectively. Too many decisions were made in isolation, without consideration of their impact on other departments or the overall mission. During her time with Park's department, Sarah had the opportunity to review training records and performance evaluations for personnel across the base. The data painted a picture of an organization with significant untapped potential, constrained by systemic problems rather than individual failures. She also discovered that several promising junior officers had requested transfers to other bases, citing limited opportunities for advancement and frustration with the operational environment. Losing talented people to preventable problems was exactly the kind of waste that effective leadership was supposed to prevent. Park himself impressed Sarah as someone who understood both the human and technical aspects of military leadership. His training programs emphasized practical problem-solving and collaborative decision-making, approaches that would be essential for implementing the changes she planned to introduce. "What's your assessment of the base's leadership development needs?" Sarah asked during one of their planning sessions. Park considered the question carefully. "Honestly, we need leaders at every level who understand that their job is to enable success rather than control behavior. Too many people confuse authority with leadership, and it creates environments where good people either leave or stop trying to excel. His words echoed Sarah's own thoughts about the challenges she would face as commanding officer. Building an effective organization required more than issuing orders and expecting compliance. It required creating conditions where people could succeed and then holding them accountable for results rather than conformity to arbitrary processes. As her month-long undercover assignment drew to a close, Sarah found herself both encouraged and concerned about what she had learned. The base possessed the human and technical resources necessary to excel at its mission, but realizing that potential would require significant changes in culture and leadership approach. She had identified key allies like Rodriguez, Thompson, and Park who could serve as champions for positive change. She had also identified sources of resistance that would need to be addressed directly and decisively. Most importantly, she had gained first-hand understanding of how the base's problems affected dedicated personnel who deserved better leadership. The night before her scheduled revelation as the new commanding officer, Sarah sat in her quarters reviewing detailed notes from her month of observations. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of the most challenging leadership assignment of her career, but she felt confident that her unconventional preparation had given her insights that no amount of briefings or reports could have provided. She thought about Wilson, still eager to contribute, but uncertain about his path forward. She thought about Janet, competently managing her responsibilities while navigating the political complications created by Stephen's poor leadership. She thought about all the personnel who had been professional and welcoming to a contractor they believed had no real authority or influence over their careers. Tomorrow, those same people would learn that the quiet woman they had been working alongside was actually Admiral Sarah Chun, the youngest person ever to command a base of this size and complexity. Some would be shocked, others embarrassed, and many would probably feel deceived by her month-long masquerade. But Sarah hoped that her actions during the past month had demonstrated something more important than her rank or credentials. She hoped they had shown her commitment to understanding their challenges, respecting their expertise, and working alongside them rather than simply issuing directives from above. The transition from undercover contractor to commanding officer would test every leadership skill she had developed during her rapid rise through the ranks. But Sarah felt ready for the challenge, armed with detailed knowledge of both the problems and the people she would be working with to solve them. The real work was about to begin. The base assembly hall had not seen a gathering this large in over 2 years. Personnel from every department filled the rows of metal chairs, their conversations creating a low buzz of speculation and nervous energy that reflected the uncertainty that had plagued Naval Base Coronado for months. Everyone knew that today would bring the official introduction of their new commanding officer, but few expected anything more than another round of empty promises and bureaucratic restructuring. Sarah Chin stood in the small preparation room adjacent to the main hall, dressed now in the crisp dress uniform that revealed her true rank for the first time since arriving at the base. The stars on her collar felt heavier than usual, weighted with the responsibility of leading an organization she had come to understand intimately from the bottom up. Through the small window, she could see the assembled personnel, many of whom she had worked alongside for the past month without revealing her true identity. Captain Morrison, the base's executive officer who had been serving as interim commander, made final adjustments to the microphone system while reviewing his introduction notes. Morrison was a competent administrator, but lacked the vision and decisiveness needed to address the base's systemic problems. His temporary leadership had maintained basic operations while inadvertently allowing existing problems to deepen. "Admiral, we're ready to proceed whenever you are," Morrison said, approaching Sarah with a mixture of respect and curiosity that had characterized their brief interactions since her arrival the previous evening in her official capacity. Sarah nodded, taking a final moment to center herself for what would be one of the most challenging revelations of her career. In a few minutes, she would transform from Sarah the contractor into Admiral Chun, and the reactions of her new command would provide the first real test of everything she had learned during her month undercover. "Let's begin," she said simply. Morrison took the stage first, calling the assembly to order with the formal protocols that marked all official military gatherings. The conversations died away as several hundred personnel turned their attention to the front of the hall, their expressions ranging from polite interest to barely concealed skepticism. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce the new commanding officer of Naval Base Coronado," Morrison announced. Admiral Sarah Chun brings extensive experience in naval operations and advanced communication systems to her new role. Please join me in welcoming Admiral Chun. The applause was polite, but restrained as Sarah walked onto the stage. She could see the exact moment when recognition began to dawn on faces throughout the audience. Janet's mouth dropped open in shock. Wilson looked like someone had just explained a magic trick that had been baffling him for weeks. Stevens and Torres, sitting together near the back of the hall, went completely pale as the implications of the past month began to sink in. Sarah took her position behind the podium and surveyed the audience with calm confidence. She had planned this moment carefully, understanding that her first words as commanding officer would set the tone for everything that followed. "Good morning," she began, her voice carrying easily through the hall without the microphone system. "I know this comes as a surprise to many of you, and I want to begin by addressing the obvious question about my previous month at this base." The silence in the hall was absolute. Sarah could see personnel leaning forward slightly, hanging on every word. "For the past 4 weeks, I have had the privilege of working alongside many of you as a civilian contractor in the communications department. This was not an attempt to deceive or spy on anyone, but rather an opportunity to understand this base's operation from the ground level before assuming command." She paused, allowing the information to sink in while observing the range of reactions across the audience. Some faces showed understanding and even approval, while others reflected embarrassment or anger at having been observed without their knowledge. During that time, I have seen extraordinary dedication and competence from personnel at every level. I have also observed systemic problems that prevent this organization from reaching its full potential. Today marks the beginning of our work together to address those challenges and build the kind of command that honors both your capabilities and our mission. Sarah's words were carefully chosen to acknowledge both the positive and negative aspects of what she had discovered, setting a tone of honest assessment rather than either false praise or harsh criticism. She wanted to establish from the beginning that her approach would be based on facts rather than assumptions. "I want to share some specific observations from my time working among you," she continued. "In the operations center, I witnessed crisis management and coordination that exemplified military excellence at its finest. In logistics, I saw creative problem solving and genuine care for personnel welfare that kept this base functioning despite resource constraints. In training and development, I encountered programs designed to bring out the best in our people." She could see Commander Rodriguez and Chief Thompson sitting near the front, their expressions showing appreciation for the recognition of their department's efforts. These were the leaders she would rely on to model the kind of excellence she wanted to see throughout the base. However, I also observed communication failures, resource waste, and resistance to change that undermined our collective effectiveness. Some of these problems stem from inadequate resources or outdated procedures, but others reflect leadership failures at multiple levels that we will address directly. The temperature in the hall seemed to drop several degrees as Sarah's words registered with personnel who recognized themselves in that assessment. Stevens was no longer pale. His face had flushed red with what appeared to be a mixture of embarrassment and anger. "Starting immediately, we will implement changes designed to eliminate bureaucratic obstacles, improve communication between departments, and create clear accountability for results rather than mere compliance with procedures. These changes will require adjustment from everyone, but they will be implemented with full consideration for the expertise and perspectives you bring to your roles." Sarah had learned from her undercover month that the base's personnel responded better to inclusive approaches than top-down directives. While she was prepared to use her authority when necessary, she preferred to build consensus around shared objectives whenever possible. Before we discuss specific operational changes, I want to address the personal dynamics that arose during my time working in various departments. Some of you welcomed me as a colleague and treated me with professional respect. Others viewed me with suspicion or hostility based on assumptions about civilian contractors and their value to military operations. The silence in the hall grew even more intense as personnel realized she was addressing the interpersonal conflicts they had witnessed or participated in during her undercover assignment. Those interactions provided valuable insights into this base's culture and the attitudes that either support or undermine our collective mission. Moving forward, I expect all personnel to demonstrate the same professionalism toward colleagues regardless of their background, rank, or role in our organization. Sarah's tone remained calm and measured, but everyone in the hall understood that she was establishing clear expectations for future behavior. The message was particularly pointed for those who had been dismissive or hostile during her time as a contractor. I also want to acknowledge the personnel who demonstrated exceptional professionalism and competence during my time working among you. Your examples provided models of the behavior and attitudes I want to see throughout this command. She made eye contact with Janet, Wilson, Rodriguez, Thompson, and several others whose conduct had impressed her during the previous month. Their recognition in front of their peers served both to reward their professionalism and to signal the kind of behavior that would be valued under her command. Now, let me outline the changes we will implement over the coming weeks. First, we will establish regular cross-departmental coordination meetings to eliminate the communication failures that have been hampering our operations. Each department will designate liaison personnel responsible for maintaining contact with other units. This change addressed one of the most significant problems Sarah had observed during her undercover assignment. Too often, departments operated in isolation, creating inefficiencies and missed opportunities for collaboration. Second, we will implement new performance evaluation criteria that emphasize results and innovation rather than rigid adherence to outdated procedures. Personnel who identify problems and propose solutions will be recognized and rewarded, regardless of their position in the organizational hierarchy. Sarah could see heads nodding throughout the audience as she described changes that address frustrations many had experienced with the previous system's emphasis on following protocols rather than achieving objectives. Third, we will establish mentorship programs pairing experienced personnel with junior staff to ensure knowledge transfer and career development. Too many talented people have requested transfers due to limited growth opportunities, and we will address that problem directly. This announcement generated visible excitement among younger personnel like Wilson, who had expressed frustration about unclear advancement paths during their conversations over the past month. Finally, we will conduct a comprehensive review of all procedures and regulations to eliminate bureaucratic obstacles that serve no useful purpose. This base will operate efficiently and effectively, not merely comply with arbitrary rules that prevent us from accomplishing our mission. The applause that followed this announcement was notably more enthusiastic than the polite response to her introduction. Sarah had identified changes that addressed real problems experienced by personnel at every level, and their reaction suggested genuine support for her proposed approach. These changes will not be implemented arbitrarily or without input from the personnel who understand day-to-day operations better than anyone else. Over the next 2 weeks, I will be conducting individual meetings with department heads and key personnel to gather detailed feedback on current procedures and proposed improvements. Sarah's commitment to consultation rather than dictation reflected lessons learned during her undercover month. The base's most competent personnel had valuable insights that needed to be incorporated into any successful reform effort. However, let me be absolutely clear about one thing, Sarah continued, her tone shifting slightly to convey unmistakable authority. While I welcome input and collaboration, the ultimate responsibility for this base's performance rests with me, and I will not tolerate insubordination or deliberate obstruction of necessary changes. Her eyes briefly met those of Stevens and Torres, leaving no doubt about the intended audience for that particular message. The warning was delivered calmly, but with the kind of quiet intensity that left no room for misinterpretation. I chose to spend my first month here working alongside you rather than issuing directives from an office because I believe leadership requires understanding the people and challenges you're actually dealing with. That same philosophy will guide my approach going forward. The statement generated another round of applause, this time with visible enthusiasm from personnel who had felt disconnected from previous leadership approaches that seemed more focused on appearance than substance. Before we conclude, I want to invite questions about these changes or any other concerns you might have about the future direction of this base. This is your opportunity to provide direct input to your commanding officer. Sarah's willingness to take questions immediately after announcing major changes demonstrated a level of confidence and transparency that surprised many in the audience. Previous commanding officers had typically avoided unscripted interactions with large groups of personnel. The first hand to go up belonged to Commander Rodriguez. Admiral, How do you envision the cross-departmental coordination meetings working in practice? Will they supplement or replace existing reporting structures? Excellent question, Sarah replied. The coordination meetings will supplement, not replace, existing chains of command. Think of them as early warning systems that allow departments to identify potential conflicts or opportunities for collaboration before they become problems. Each department will maintain its internal structure while improving communication with other units. The next question came from a young petty officer in the maintenance department. Ma'am, will the new performance evaluation criteria affect personnel who are already scheduled for advancement reviews? All personnel will be evaluated under the new criteria, but the changes are designed to provide additional opportunities for recognition rather than creating new obstacles, Sarah answered. If you're performing well under the current system, you'll likely perform even better under evaluations that recognize initiative and results. Chief Thompson raised his hand next. Admiral, what kind of timeline are you looking at for implementing these changes? Will departments have time to prepare for new procedures? The implementation will be phased over the next 3 months, with different changes taking effect at different times, Sarah explained. No department will be expected to adapt to all changes simultaneously, and training will be provided for any new procedures that significantly alter current practices. The questions continued for nearly 30 minutes, covering everything from resource allocation to career development opportunities. Sarah answered each inquiry with the kind of detailed knowledge that reflected both her formal preparation and her month of ground-level observation. As the question period concluded, Sarah surveyed the faces before her one final time. The expressions she saw ranged from excited enthusiasm to cautious optimism, with only a few showing the kind of skeptical resistance that had characterized some interactions during her undercover month. Thank you for your attention and your questions, Sarah concluded. My door will remain open to anyone who wishes to discuss these changes or other concerns in more detail. Together, we will build a base that exemplifies excellence in everything we do. Dismissed. As personnel began filing out of the assembly hall, Sarah noticed the clustering of conversations and the energy level that suggested genuine engagement with the changes she had announced. She also noticed Stevens and Torres leaving together without making eye contact, their body language suggesting they were planning their response to this unexpected development. Commander Rodriguez approached the stage as the crowd dispersed. Admiral, if I may say so, that was masterfully handled. The personal touch of working undercover first was brilliant strategy. Sarah smiled slightly. Thank you, Commander. I learned more in that month than any number of briefings could have taught me. Now comes the real challenge of turning observations into improvements. You can count on full support from operations, Rodriguez assured her. Your approach gives me confidence that these changes will actually make a difference instead of just creating more paperwork. As Sarah left the stage, she reflected on the mixed reactions she had observed during her first official appearance as commanding officer. The majority of personnel seemed genuinely excited about the changes she had proposed, but she knew that the real test would come in the implementation phase when abstract promises became concrete requirements. The next few weeks would determine whether her unconventional approach to assuming command would translate into actual improvements in base operations. But for the first time since arriving at Naval Base Coronado, Sarah felt confident that positive change was not only possible, but inevitable. The first week following Sarah's revelation as commanding officer brought a mixture of enthusiasm and underlying tension that reflected the complex dynamics she had observed during her undercover month. While most personnel embraced the proposed changes with genuine excitement, a small but vocal group began organizing resistance that threatened to undermine her reform efforts before they could gain momentum. The resistance centered around Lieutenant Stevens and Staff Sergeant Torres, who had been humiliated by the discovery that the contractor they had been dismissing and undermining was actually their commanding officer. Rather than accepting the situation and adapting to new expectations, they began spreading doubt about Sarah's qualifications and methods among their personal networks throughout the base. She deceived all of us, Stevens complained to anyone who would listen. How can we trust someone who spent a month lying about who she really was? What else is she hiding from us? Sarah learned about these conversations through Janet, who had become an informal source of intelligence about departmental morale and personnel reactions. Janet's loyalty had been secured not just by Sarah's revelation, but by the respect she had shown during their month working together and the concrete improvements she was already implementing in communications operations. Stevens is really worked up about the whole situation, Janet reported during one of their private meetings. He's been telling people that your undercover assignment was unethical and that you can't be trusted to lead fairly since you were basically spying on everyone. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. She had expected this kind of reaction from Stevens and had prepared accordingly. What's the general response to his complaints? Mixed, Janet admitted. Some people think he has a point about the deception aspect, but most seem more impressed that you cared enough to understand our daily reality before making changes. Torres is backing him up, but she doesn't have as much credibility after some of the things she said about civilian contractors in general. The resistance campaign reached a crisis point during the second week when Stevens formally requested a meeting with Admiral Patricia Hawkins, the regional commander responsible for overseeing multiple bases in the Pacific Fleet. Stevens' complaint alleged that Sarah's undercover assignment constituted inappropriate surveillance of military personnel and created ethical conflicts that compromised her ability to command effectively. Sarah received notification of Stevens' complaint through official channels and immediately requested her own meeting with Admiral Hawkins to provide context for her unconventional approach to assuming command. The meeting would take place via secure video conference, giving Sarah the opportunity to explain her methods before Stevens could frame the narrative entirely around his grievances. Admiral Hawkins was a career officer known for her direct communication style and intolerance for political maneuvering that interfered with operational effectiveness. Sarah had served under her command earlier in her career and respected both her judgment and her commitment to supporting innovative approaches that delivered results. Admiral Chun, Hawkins began when a video conference connection was established. I've received some concerning complaints about your methods for assuming command at Coronado. Before I hear from Lieutenant Stevens, I want to understand your perspective on this situation. Sarah had prepared extensively for this conversation, understanding that her entire reform effort could be derailed if Hawkins concluded that her approach had been inappropriate or counterproductive. Admiral, I requested the undercover assignment because previous attempts to reform Coronado had failed due to incomplete understanding of the operational culture and personnel dynamics, Sarah explained. Traditional assumption of command procedures provide commanders with official reports and formal briefings, but they don't reveal the informal resistance networks that have been undermining change efforts for years. Hawkins listened without interruption as Sarah detailed her month of observations and the insights they had provided into the base's systemic problems. She emphasized the positive discoveries as well as the challenges, painting a complete picture of an organization with significant potential constrained by leadership and cultural issues. The complaint about deception missed the fundamental point, Sarah continued. I wasn't gathering information for punitive purposes, but rather to understand how to implement changes that would actually improve operations rather than simply create new forms of bureaucratic compliance. When Sarah finished her explanation, Hawkins was quiet for a moment, processing the information and considering its implications for both command authority and operational effectiveness. Your approach was certainly unconventional, Hawkins finally said. Tell me about the results you've achieved so far. Sarah had anticipated this question and prepared specific examples of improvements that had already been implemented during her first 2 weeks as official commanding officer. Communication failures between departments have been reduced by 60% through the coordination meetings we established, Sarah reported. Equipment downtime has decreased by 25% due to better maintenance, scheduling, and resource allocation. Personnel satisfaction surveys show significant improvement in morale and confidence in leadership direction. The statistics were impressive, but Sarah knew that Hawkins would be more interested in the underlying changes that produced those numbers. More importantly, Sarah continued, we've identified and begun addressing the informal resistance networks that have been sabotaging reform efforts. The personnel involved aren't necessarily incompetent, but they've developed an investment in maintaining problems that allow them to operate without accountability. Hawkins' expression sharpened at this observation. As a regional commander, she had seen similar patterns at other bases where entrenched interests resisted changes that threatened their established positions. Give me specific examples of this resistance and how you're addressing it. Sarah provided detailed accounts of Stevens and Torres' behavior during her undercover month, their current campaign to undermine her authority, and the broader network of personnel who had been protecting each other from accountability while preventing improvements that might expose their inefficiencies. The key insight from my undercover observation, Sarah explained, is that these individuals aren't failing due to lack of capability, but because the previous command structure allowed them to avoid responsibility for results while maintaining their positions through political maneuvering rather than performance. After Sarah concluded her explanation, Hawkins conducted her own interview with Stevens via video conference. Sarah wasn't present for that conversation, but she learned later that Stevens had focused primarily on the ethical implications of her deception while providing little substantive evidence of actual problems with her command decisions. The resolution came 2 days later when Admiral Hawkins issued a formal statement supporting Sarah's approach and methods. The statement praised her innovative preparation for command and the measurable improvements already achieved under her leadership. Admiral Chen's unconventional approach to assuming command demonstrates exactly the kind of creative problem-solving we need in today's challenging operational environment, Hawkins wrote in her official response to Stevens' complaint. The results speak for themselves, and I expect all personnel at Coronado to support her reform efforts with the same professionalism they would demonstrate toward any commanding officer. Stevens' failed attempt to undermine Sarah's authority through appeals to higher command had the opposite effect of what he intended. Instead of raising doubts about her methods, it highlighted her effectiveness and secured explicit support from regional leadership for her reform initiatives. The aftermath of the complaint resolution marked a turning point in base operations. Personnel who had been uncertain about supporting changes that might create conflict with established power structures now understood that resistance would not be tolerated at any level of command. Stevens himself requested a transfer to another base within days of Hawkins' statement, apparently recognizing that his position had become untenable under Sarah's leadership. Torres followed suit shortly afterward, removing 2 of the most problematic sources of resistance to necessary changes. With the primary sources of organized opposition eliminated, Sarah was able to accelerate implementation of her reform initiatives. The communication coordination meetings evolved from mandatory obligations into genuinely useful forums for identifying opportunities and solving problems collaboratively. Commander Rodriguez emerged as a key ally in expanding successful approaches from operations to other departments. Her experience with crisis management and team coordination provided models that could be adapted to different organizational challenges throughout the base. The difference is night and day, Rodriguez observed during one of their weekly planning meetings. When people understand that their input is valued and their efforts are recognized, they start looking for ways to excel instead of just ways to avoid blame. Chief Thompson's logistics department became another showcase for the kind of improvements possible when competent personnel were freed from bureaucratic constraints and empowered to solve problems creatively. His team's innovations in supply chain management and resource allocation began generating cost savings and efficiency improvements that attracted positive attention from regional command. Perhaps most significantly, Sarah's reforms began attracting talented personnel who had previously requested transfers due to frustration with the operational environment. Young officers and enlisted personnel started viewing Coronado as a desirable assignment where they could develop their capabilities and contribute to meaningful missions. Petty Officer Wilson exemplified this transformation. During Sarah's undercover month, he had been enthusiastic but uncertain about his career path and contribution to the organization. Under the new command structure, he quickly emerged as a leader among junior personnel and was selected for advanced training programs that would accelerate his professional development. Admiral, I wanted to thank you for the opportunities you've created, Wilson said during one of their informal conversations. For the first time since I arrived here, I feel like I understand how my work fits into the bigger picture and where I'm heading in my career. Sarah appreciated Wilson's feedback, but she was even more pleased by the broader pattern it represented. Talented people throughout the base were beginning to realize their potential because they were working in an environment that supported excellence rather than merely demanding compliance. The transformation wasn't without ongoing challenges. Implementing systemic changes required constant attention to both major policy shifts and countless small adjustments in procedures, attitudes, and expectations. Sarah found herself working longer hours than she had anticipated, but the visible improvements in base operations provided motivation to maintain the demanding pace. 3 months after her revelation as commanding officer, Naval Base Coronado was operating at efficiency levels that hadn't been seen in years. Equipment failures were down, personnel satisfaction was up, and the base was completing its assigned missions ahead of schedule and under budget. More importantly, the organizational culture had shifted from one of defensive resistance to change toward one of collaborative problem-solving and continuous improvement. Personnel at every level understood that their contributions were valued and that excellent performance would be recognized and rewarded. The success of Sarah's reforms began attracting attention from other bases facing similar challenges. Admiral Hawkins asked her to share her methods with other commanding officers struggling with entrenched resistance to necessary changes. Your approach proves that leadership innovation can produce dramatic results when it's based on genuine understanding of organizational dynamics rather than theoretical models, Hawkins said during one of their regular review meetings. We're already seeing requests from other commands for consultation on similar reform efforts. Sarah felt gratified by the recognition, but she remained focused on the ongoing work of building and maintaining the kind of organization that brought out the best in everyone involved. The initial resistance had been overcome, but sustaining positive change would require continued attention to both results and relationships. As she reflected on the journey from undercover contractor to successful commanding officer, Sarah realized that the most valuable lesson hadn't been about deception or surprise, but about the importance of understanding people before attempting to lead them. Her month working alongside the personnel she now commanded had provided insights that no amount of formal preparation could have delivered. The real test of her leadership wouldn't be measured in the dramatic turnaround of the first few months, but in the base's ability to maintain and build upon these improvements over time. That would require developing other leaders throughout the organization who could sustain the culture of excellence she had worked to establish. 6 months after Admiral Sarah Chin's dramatic revelation as commanding officer, Naval Base Coronado had become a model for military leadership and organizational effectiveness throughout the Pacific Fleet. The transformation was so complete that visiting officers often expressed disbelief that the same facility had been struggling with systemic problems just months earlier. The base's success wasn't measured solely in operational statistics, though those numbers were impressive. Equipment reliability had improved by 40%, personnel retention was at an all-time high, and mission completion rates exceeded fleet averages by significant margins. More importantly, the organizational culture had evolved into something that attracted the best talent and brought out exceptional performance from everyone involved. Sarah stood in her office reviewing the latest performance reports while preparing for a visit from Admiral Patricia Hawkins, who was bringing a delegation of commanding officers from other bases to observe Coronado's transformation firsthand. The visit represented both recognition of their achievements and an opportunity to share successful methods with leaders facing similar challenges elsewhere. Through her window, Sarah could see personnel moving across the base with the kind of purposeful energy that characterized organizations where people understood their mission and felt confident in their leadership. The contrast with the atmosphere she had encountered during her undercover month was striking, but she knew that sustaining this level of excellence required constant attention to both results and relationships. A knock on her door interrupted her review of the reports. Commander Rodriguez entered, followed by Chief Thompson and Lieutenant Commander Park, the core leadership team that had emerged during the reform process. Their regular planning meetings had evolved into collaborative sessions that addressed both immediate operational needs and long-term strategic development. Admiral, the delegation from Admiral Hawkins' office has arrived, Rodriguez reported. They're particularly interested in our cross-departmental coordination protocols and the performance evaluation changes we've implemented. Sarah nodded, gathering the materials she had prepared for the presentation. Have I had a chance to observe any of the coordination meetings in action? Chief Thompson arranged for them to sit in on this morning's logistics planning session, Park replied. They seemed impressed by how smoothly information flowed between departments and how quickly decisions were made when problems arose. The delegation's visit represented more than simple professional curiosity. Several of the visiting commanding officers were dealing with resistance to change similar to what Sarah had encountered upon her arrival. Admiral Hawkins hoped that seeing successful implementation of innovative leadership methods might provide them with practical approaches to their own challenges. When Sarah arrived at the conference room where the presentation would take place, she found a group of senior officers whose expressions ranged from skeptical interest to genuine enthusiasm. She recognized the look of leaders who had been struggling with organizational problems without finding effective solutions. Good morning, Sarah began without preamble. I understand you're here to learn about our transformation process. Before I explain what we did, I want to acknowledge what we started with, because I suspect many of you are dealing with similar challenges. The directness of her approach immediately captured the attention of officers who were accustomed to presentations that emphasize successes while minimizing difficulties. 6 months ago, this base was characterized by communication failures, resource waste, low morale, and active resistance to change from entrenched personnel who had learned to benefit from organizational dysfunction, Sarah continued. Those problems didn't exist because people lacked competence or dedication, but because the leadership structure had allowed destructive patterns to become institutionalized. Captain Rebecca Martinez from Naval Station San Diego leaned forward with obvious interest. How did you identify the source of the resistance? Traditional assessment methods don't usually reveal informal power networks that operate outside official channels. Sarah smiled, recognizing the frustration behind the question. That's exactly why I spent my first month here working undercover as a civilian contractor. I needed to understand the real dynamics before attempting to implement changes that might be sabotaged by people I didn't even know were working against organizational success. The room erupted in surprise conversations as the visiting officers processed this revelation. Most had heard rumors about Sarah's unconventional approach to assuming command, but few understood the extent of her undercover preparation. You worked as a contractor for a full month? Asked Commander James Sullivan from Naval Air Station North Island. How did you manage that without compromising your authority once you revealed your actual position? The key was demonstrating competence and respect for the people I was working alongside, Sarah explained. By the time I revealed my identity, I had established relationships based on professional collaboration rather than hierarchical authority. People knew I understood their daily challenges because I had been dealing with those same challenges myself. Admiral Hawkins, who had been observing the discussion with satisfaction, added her own perspective. The results speak for themselves. Coronado's performance improvements have been among the most dramatic we've seen in the Pacific Fleet, and, more importantly, they've been sustained over time rather than representing temporary gains. Sarah spent the next 2 hours detailing the specific changes they had implemented and the methods used to overcome resistance while building consensus around necessary reforms. She emphasized the importance of identifying natural leaders at every level who could serve as champions for positive change, while also addressing sources of active obstruction decisively. The most important lesson, Sarah concluded, is that organizational transformation requires understanding people before attempting to change systems. Too many reform efforts fail because they focus on procedures and policies without addressing the human dynamics that determine whether those changes will actually be implemented effectively. During the question period that followed, Sarah was struck by the similarity of challenges facing bases throughout the region. The problems she had encountered at Coronado weren't unique, but reflected broader issues within military organizational culture that needed to be addressed systematically. Lieutenant Commander Patricia Wong from Naval Base Point Loma raised a particularly insightful question. How do you maintain the momentum for change once the initial enthusiasm wears off? It seems like most reform efforts start strong, but gradually revert to previous patterns. Sustainable change requires developing leadership capabilities throughout the organization, Sarah replied. We established mentorship programs, cross-training initiatives, and decision-making processes that distribute authority while maintaining accountability. The goal is to create systems that continue improving even when specific individuals move to new assignments. This point led to a discussion of leadership development that extended well beyond the scheduled presentation time. Sarah found herself sharing specific examples of how talented personnel like Wilson, who had started as an uncertain junior officer, were now taking leadership roles that contributed to continued organizational improvement. After the delegation completed their visit, Admiral Hawkins requested a private meeting with Sarah to discuss broader applications of her methods. They walked along the base perimeter, observing the activity and energy that characterized daily operations under the transformed command structure. I'm getting requests for consultation visits from commands throughout the Pacific, Hawkins said. Your approach has generated interest at levels I didn't expect. Are you prepared for that kind of broader responsibility? Sarah considered the question carefully. She was deeply committed to the ongoing work at Coronado, but she also recognized the potential value of sharing successful methods with other leaders facing similar challenges. I think the real value isn't in replicating exactly what we did here, but in demonstrating that innovative approaches to leadership challenges can produce dramatic results, Sarah replied. Each base has its own culture and specific problems, but the underlying principles of understanding before changing and building consensus around shared objectives should be applicable anywhere. Their conversation was interrupted by Petty Officer Wilson, who approached with the kind of confident bearing that reflected his rapid professional development over the past months. He had been selected for officer candidate school and would be leaving Coronado soon to continue his career at a higher level. "Admiral, I wanted to thank you again before I leave for training," Wilson said. "The opportunities you created here changed the entire trajectory of my career, but more importantly, they show me what leadership can accomplish when it's focused on bringing out the best in people." Sarah appreciated Wilson's gratitude, but she was even more pleased by the broader pattern his success represented. Talented personnel throughout the base had been able to realize their potential because they were working in an environment that supported excellence and provided clear paths for advancement. As Wilson returned to his duties, Admiral Hawkins observed with obvious approval. "That young man represents exactly the kind of result that justifies unconventional approaches to leadership development." "How many similar success stories have you seen?" "Dozens," Sarah replied without hesitation. "The transformation isn't just about organizational efficiency, though that's certainly important. It's about creating conditions where people can excel and then holding them accountable for results rather than compliance with arbitrary procedures." Their discussion continued as they completed their tour of the base, covering everything from resource allocation strategies to personnel development programs. Hawkins was particularly interested in the sustainability measures Sarah had implemented to ensure continued improvement even as personnel rotated to new assignments. "The real test of any organizational change," Hawkins observed, "is whether it survives leadership transitions. You've built something here that seems designed to continue improving regardless of who's in command." Sarah nodded, reflecting on the systems and culture they had established over the past months. "That was always the goal. Personal leadership is important, but sustainable excellence requires institutional capabilities that don't depend on any single individual." As the day concluded, Sarah found herself thinking about the journey from her initial undercover assignment to the thriving organization Coronado had become. The resistance she had encountered from people like Stevens and Torres seemed almost quaint now, given the level of enthusiastic collaboration that characterized current operations. More importantly, the success at Coronado was beginning to influence broader discussions about military leadership and organizational development. Admiral Hawkins had mentioned that Sarah's methods were being studied at command schools and incorporated into training programs for future leaders. That evening, Sarah attended a farewell gathering for Wilson and several other personnel who were being promoted or transferred to new assignments. The celebration reflected the kind of positive organizational culture that had emerged from their transformation efforts, with people genuinely excited about career advancement opportunities rather than viewing transfers as escapes from problematic situations. Janet Morrison, who had become one of Sarah's most trusted advisors, approached during the gathering. "Admiral, I've been here for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what you've accomplished. But what impresses me most is how you've created something that will continue improving even after you move on to your next assignment." Sarah appreciated Janet's perspective, particularly since she had witnessed the entire transformation from its beginning during those early days when Sarah was working undercover in the communications department. Janet's loyalty and support had been crucial during the difficult early weeks of implementing changes. "The real credit belongs to people like you who are willing to embrace change and work collaboratively to solve problems," Sarah replied. "Leaders can create opportunities, but excellence requires commitment from everyone involved." As the evening concluded, Sarah reflected on the broader implications of their success. The methods they had developed at Coronado were already being adapted by other commands, and the personnel who were rotating to new assignments were carrying those approaches to bases throughout the fleet. The transformation that had begun with her unconventional decision to work undercover had evolved into something much larger than addressing problems at a single base. It had become a demonstration that innovative leadership approaches could produce dramatic improvements in military organizational effectiveness. Looking toward the future, Sarah knew that her time at Coronado would eventually end as she received new assignments and greater responsibilities. But the foundation they had built would continue supporting excellence long after her departure, and the people who had participated in the transformation would carry those lessons throughout their careers. The greatest satisfaction came not from the recognition her methods had received, but from knowing that talented personnel at every level now had opportunities to excel and contribute to missions that mattered. That was the true measure of successful leadership, and it was a legacy that would continue growing long after her direct involvement had ended. As Sarah walked back to her quarters, she could see the lights of ships in the harbor and hear the purposeful activity that continued around the clock at a fully functional military base. The transformation was complete, but the work of maintaining and building upon that excellence would continue as long as people remained committed to bringing out the best in themselves and each other.